The incident began on a Thursday evening in October when Ronaldo and several teammates decided to celebrate a recent victory with dinner at an exclusive restaurant in Madrid's Salamanca district. And when they arrived at the establishment where Ronaldo had dined many times before without incident, the maître d' greeted them with the usual professional courtesy until he noticed Youssef, a midfielder from Morocco who had joined Real Madrid 6 months earlier, and whose presence in the group seemed to create immediate tension that transformed the restaurant staff's welcoming demeanor into barely concealed hostility that became more obvious as the evening progressed. And it became clear that the discrimination was systematic rather than the result of individual prejudice from a single employee. Youssef had been one of the most promising young players in European football when Real Madrid signed him from a French club where he had distinguished himself through exceptional technical skills and professional dedication that had earned respect from teammates and coaches who valued his contributions to team success, regardless of his Moroccan heritage and Islamic faith. But his transition to Spanish football had been complicated by media coverage that focused more on his religious practices and cultural background than on his athletic abilities, and he had learned to expect a certain level of scrutiny and occasional discrimination that came with being one of the few Arab players in La Liga where diversity was celebrated in theory but not always welcomed in practice. The first sign of discrimination came when the group was seated at a table in the back corner of the restaurant, despite having a reservation that should have guaranteed them better seating. And when Ronaldo questioned why they had been placed in what was clearly the least desirable location, when the main dining room had several empty tables that would have provided better service and atmosphere. The maître d'hôtel's explanation about table assignments and restaurant policy seemed designed to avoid acknowledging the obvious connection between their seating arrangement and Youssef's presence in the group, though his discomfort when making these excuses suggested that he understood the discriminatory nature of his decisions. The service that followed was noticeably different from what Ronaldo had experienced during previous visits to the restaurant, with delays in taking orders, mistakes in food preparation, and a general lack of attention that seemed designed to make the group feel unwelcome rather than providing the high-quality service that justified the restaurant's reputation and premium prices. And while the discrimination was subtle enough to be plausibly denied, it was obvious enough to create an atmosphere of tension that made conversation difficult and transformed what should have been a celebration into an uncomfortable experience that revealed the persistent racism that existed in spaces where minorities were theoretically welcome but practically excluded through treatment that encouraged them to seek dining experiences elsewhere. The breaking point came when a server made a comment about certain types of people not understanding European dining customs while delivering Youssef's meal, a remark that was clearly intended to be overheard by the entire table, and that revealed the kind of casual racism that often characterized interactions between service staff and minority customers who were assumed to be unfamiliar with social norms that were actually universal principles of courtesy and respect, rather than European cultural practices that required special knowledge or adaptation. And the server's obvious expectation that his comment would be ignored or accepted rather than challenged demonstrated how normalized such discrimination had become in environments where minorities rarely had advocates who were willing to confront racist behavior directly. Ronaldo's response was immediate and forceful, his voice carrying clearly across the dining room as he demanded that the server explain exactly what he meant by his comment and what dining customs he believed Youssef didn't understand. And when the server attempted to backtrack and claim that his remark had been misunderstood, Ronaldo's follow-up questions made it clear that he would not accept euphemisms or denials that attempted to disguise obvious discrimination as cultural misunderstanding or communication problems that could be resolved through better explanation rather than fundamental changes in attitude and behavior toward customers who deserved equal treatment regardless of their ethnic or religious backgrounds. The confrontation that followed attracted attention from other diners and restaurant management, with the owner appearing at their table to attempt damage control that focused more on protecting the restaurant's reputation than addressing the discriminatory treatment that had prompted the complaint. And when he suggested that perhaps there had been a misunderstanding that could be resolved through complimentary drinks or desserts, Ronaldo made it clear that the problem was not poor service that could be corrected through gestures of hospitality, but systematic discrimination that revealed institutional racism rather than individual mistakes that could be addressed through staff retraining or policy clarification. "This is not about misunderstandings or cultural differences," Ronaldo said, his voice loud enough for surrounding tables to hear clearly. "This is about your staff treating my teammate differently because he is Arab and Muslim, and your assumption that we would accept discriminatory treatment as long as you provided some free food to compensate for the racism that we witnessed tonight. But I want you to understand that discrimination is not a service problem that can be fixed with complimentary appetizers. It is a moral problem that reveals the character of your establishment and your staff, who feel comfortable expressing prejudice because they assume their customers share their racist attitudes." The owner's attempts to deny that discrimination had occurred were undermined by the obvious evidence of differential treatment that multiple witnesses had observed. And when he suggested that perhaps the group would be more comfortable dining elsewhere if they were dissatisfied with the service, his response revealed the kind of exclusionary attitude that treated complaints about discrimination as customer service problems rather than civil rights violations that required acknowledgement, apology, and systematic changes in staff training and restaurant policies that would prevent similar incidents from occurring in the future. Youssef's response to the confrontation was characterized by dignity and restraint, despite the obvious humiliation he had experienced, and his attempt to minimize the incident and suggest that they simply leave reflected both his professionalism and his unfortunate familiarity with discrimination that had taught him to expect such treatment in certain social environments. But Ronaldo's refusal to allow the incident to be dismissed or ignored demonstrated his understanding that addressing racism required confrontation rather than avoidance, and that people with influence had responsibilities to use their platforms to challenge discrimination when they witnessed it, rather than simply protecting themselves and their friends through private solutions that left systematic problems unchanged. The decision to leave the restaurant was accompanied by Ronaldo's public statement to other diners about what they had witnessed. His explanation that the differential treatment was based on racial and religious prejudice rather than service standards or cultural misunderstandings, and his suggestion that other customers should consider whether they wanted to support businesses that practice discrimination against patrons whose only offense was their ethnic or religious identity. And this public confrontation created immediate consequences for the restaurant, as several other groups of diners expressed their own discomfort with what they had witnessed and chose to leave, rather than continuing to support an establishment whose discriminatory practices had been exposed so dramatically. The media coverage that followed focused initially on Ronaldo's confrontation with restaurant staff, but the deeper story that emerged was about the discrimination faced by Arab and Muslim athletes in European sports, where their success on the field was often accompanied by social exclusion and cultural hostility that affected their personal lives and professional relationships. And Youssef's willingness to speak publicly about his experiences helped illuminate the broader patterns of discrimination that affected minority athletes who faced scrutiny and hostility that their teammates and coaches often didn't recognize or understand because they hadn't experienced such treatment personally. The boycott campaign that developed around the incident was organized not by Ronaldo, but by civil rights organizations and community groups that used the high-profile nature of the discrimination to draw attention to broader patterns of racism in hospitality industries, where minorities often faced subtle but systematic exclusion through seating policies, service standards, and staff attitudes that created hostile environments, while maintaining plausible deniability about discriminatory intent. And the campaign's success in generating negative publicity and economic consequences demonstrated how celebrity advocacy could amplify civil rights concerns that might otherwise have been ignored or dismissed as isolated incidents. The restaurant's eventual closure 6 months later was attributed partly to the economic impact of the boycott campaign, but more significantly, to the reputation damage that had resulted from being identified as a business that practiced discrimination. And while some observers argued that destroying someone's livelihood over a single incident was disproportionate punishment, civil rights advocates maintained that businesses had responsibilities to serve all customers equally, and that economic consequences were appropriate responses to discriminatory practices that violated both legal requirements and moral obligations that came with operating public accommodations. The foundation that emerged from the incident focused on combating discrimination in hospitality and service industries, providing training for restaurant staff and management about cultural sensitivity and legal requirements regarding equal service, supporting legal challenges to discriminatory practices, and creating recognition programs for businesses that demonstrated exceptional commitment to serving diverse customer bases without regard to race, religion, or national origin. And the Foundation's work helped establish industry standards that reduced discrimination, while educating business owners about the economic benefits of inclusive practices that attracted rather than excluded potential customers from minority communities. Years later, when Youssef had become one of Real Madrid's most successful players and had established himself as an advocate for diversity and inclusion in professional sports, when industry-wide changes had reduced but not eliminated discrimination in hospitality services, when the incident had become a case study in how individual acts of courage could catalyze broader social changes that benefited entire communities, Ronaldo would reflect that confronting the restaurant discrimination had been one of the most important decisions of his career, because it had demonstrated that friendship required action rather than just sympathy, that celebrity status created obligations to challenge injustice rather than simply avoiding uncomfortable situations, and that addressing racism required public confrontation rather than private accommodation that allowed discriminatory practices to continue, while protecting those with influence from the consequences of systematic prejudice that affected people who lacked similar protection or advocacy.